Okay. Vino Adonai Eloheinu aleinu maaseh aldeinu konena aleinu maaseh aldeinu koneu. I'd like to dedicate this year today for the Refuah Shema of my mother, Ruth Bat Avraham, Ruach Adonai Tenechena Began. Chas v'shalom, Havdil. El Narafan Allah, El Narafan Allah, El Narafan Allah. Okay, so parasha we have this Bezat Hashem this Shabbat is Parashat Mishpati, is Parashat Terumah. But given the fact that we missed a little bit from Mishpatim last week, I have to make up for a little bit. So we'll discuss a little bit from both of the parasha. So in Parashat Terumah it says, "Ve'asu li mikdash v'shachanti betocham," that you shall make for me a sanctuary and I will dwell within you. Of course, many of the Mefarshim asked the question. That's not really grammatically correct. It should say "Ve'asu li mikdash v'shachanti betocha," or betocho, depending if you want a masculine or feminine. You make for me a sanctuary, I only dwell in it. That's not what it says. It says, Ve'asu li mikdash, you should make for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell amongst you. So if you look at the Rashi, what does the Rashi say on this pasuk? Ve'asu, what does it mean? Ve'asu li shmi bet kedusha. Li, what is ve'asu li? Make for me, li shmi, which means any avodah that a person does should always be done, l'shem shamayim. There are many mitzvot people do. Sometimes we don't do it for the best reasons. We do it for our own personal interests. That's not ideal. Ideally, we should do mitzvah because it's for Hashem. And everything we should do is for the benefit of Hashem. We don't understand why Hashem benefits from our mitzvah observance. But once again, we don't have to understand why Hashem benefits or enjoys or gets nachat ruach from our mitzvot. But he does. And how do we know he does? Because in a couple of parashot we're going to read throughout Sefer Vayikra, what does it say? Ishe reach nihoach ladonai. Ishe is a sacrifice. Ishe, not isha. Ishe from fire. Reach nihoach ladonai, meaning a pleasant smell for Hashem. So we understand from here that avodah, which of course is what Sefer Vayikra mostly talks about, is avodah in the Bet HaMikdash. Any avodah that is done by the Jewish people gives reach nichoach, a pleasant smell to Hashem. So we understand from here Hashem gets pleasure and benefit from our mitzvot. We can see it a little bit when we have children, and especially when we have grandchildren, that when they do things that are according to the Torah, according to the way they're brought up, it gives nachat ruach to the parents and to the grandparents when they see children going in the proper derech. So we can begin to understand this. Maybe at your age it's hard to understand that, but that's okay. As one get older, I promise you, you will see it, Bezvat Hashem, if you have the zechut to have children and grandchildren, that you will see that they give a tremendous amount of nachat ruach, so we can begin to understand what this is talking about. Okay, so that's Rashi. Ve'asu li mikdash bet kedusha. What is bet kedusha? A house of holiness. What does the word kadosh mean? Holy. But what does that mean? That has no meaning. It's an English word that has really no meaning. What does it mean when we say kadosh? What makes this place a makom kadosh? We agree this is a makom kadosh, yes? Mm-hmm. What makes this a makom kadosh? Okay, but you can learn at home. A Bet Knesset is a place of kedusha. People have Sefer Torah at home sometimes, yes. Why is home not necessarily, it can be have a Kedusha, but it's not the same as the Kedusha of the Bet HaMidrash and Bet HaKnesset? Oh, good. So what makes the Bet HaMikdash holy? Let's answer that question. Good. And why does Hashem fill that place with his presence? Because it's designated. Ve'asu li mikdash. Your home may be for God, but also maybe for yourself. You eat there, you sleep there. There's other things you got to take care of over there, yes? When one sets up a Bet Midrash, when one sets up a Bet Knesset, hopefully we're doing that l'shem shamayim, which means that is a place that is designated for Hashem. The way a person behaves in Bet Midrash and in Bet Knesset is not the way one behaves at home. And there's a siman in the Shulchan Aruch that specifically deals with how a person is supposed to behave in the Bet HaKnesset, in the Bet HaMidrash, which is different than you do at home. I'll give you an example. Chamavad Yosef says that when a person is at home, there's no issue with you crossing your legs when you're sitting at the dinner table or whatever you're doing at home, right? But in Bet Knesset, a person should not be crossing their legs. It's a level of relaxation that really one is not entitled to, because since this is a place that is designated for Hashem, one should not be relaxed. One should have certain level of discomfort, or shall we say yir'ah, when a person comes to a place of holiness. The halacha is, even though I'm not sure how we get around it often, halacha is one is not allowed to eat or to sleep in a Bet Knesset. A Talmid Chacham who is learning all day long, or a student who is learning all day long in the Bet HaMidrash, is allowed to eat in the Bet HaMidrash, preferably not to sleep. Okay, mitnamnem is one thing, but to have a good snooze, one should not be doing that in the place of learning. One should do that outside the place of learning. And of course, during the rabbi's speech, that's definitely not a problem. A person should be sleeping ever. Okay, so continuing on, it says over here in the Torah Tmima, which is a wonderful sefer. If you guys are not familiar with it, it's I think one of the better sefarim written in the past couple of 100 years, where Rabbi Baruch Halevi Epstein, who was the son of the Aruch HaShulchan, basically took the Torah Shebichtav and he put it together with the Torah Sheba'al Peh, because many people, they go through the parasha and they study Rashi, they study Rambam, they study Rashbam, they study Ibn Ezra, they study all these Mifarshim, but these Mifarshim are all from what period of time? They're all Rishonim. Yonatan ben Uziel and Onkelos being exceptions, right? But these Mefarshim are Rishonim. And wonderful to study the Rishonim, or what they say in the parasha. But one also has to learn what is Midrash Chachamim from the time of the Gemara, from the time of the rabbis of the Talmud. And that is not easily accessible. Because when you learn Talmud, you can always find where you find the source in the Torah. You look on the title, tell you what pasuk is. But often when a person is studying the parasha, unless you know exactly where to look, Ner Mitzvah Torah, or sometimes you have that, it's hard to find where the Talmud talks about that pasuk. The Torah Temimah took them and put them together. And that's why he called it Torah Temimah. What does the word Temimah means? Complete. There is no Torah Shebichtav without Torah Sheba'al Peh, and there is no Torah Sheba'al Peh without the Torah Shebichtav, putting them together. So in the Torah Temimah, he brings the various items. So if a person looks at a pasuk and wants to see what the Gemara or what the Chachamim and the Talmud say about it, this is a wonderful sefer to look at. So continuing on in the Torah Temimah, he mentions, and this of course is from Masechet, one second. This is from, I don't have where it's from. Forgive me. Okay? But he's always quoting from the Talmud. It says, Ve'asu mikdash, Taneh, it was taught in the Baraita. Koche bedek habayit nohagin mahen leumanim bischaram. Okay? Meaning what? The temple has a fund. That fund is called bedek habayit. What is bedek habayit? That's how the temple, if there's construction projects that need to go on, if there's any type of a building, the artisans that are required, there are funds in the Bet HaBayit which are donated by Klal Yisrael in order to support the building of the Bet HaMikdash, building or things in the temple. Yes. What happens when they need to hire a contractor or an artisan to actually do the melacha in the Bet HaMikdash? That contractor, that artisan, is paid. Doesn't have to do it for free, is paid through the funds of Bedek HaBayit. But the funds of Bedek HaBayit are kadosh. So here the Gemara learns what? The Asuli Mikdash, which means when you build my temple, please make sure that you pay the people who work in the temple from my funds, not from your funds. Continuing on, we have also in the Torah Temimah, it says, V'shachanti betocham, the question we asked ourselves. Tanya Rabbi Tarfon Omer, Rabbi Tarfon said, Gedola melacha, great people have a tendency to say, oh, work, what is work? Gedola melacha, and here we're talking about work, we're talking about avodah, we're talking about work, regular work that a person does to make a living, yes? It says here, Gedola melacha she'af HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Lo hishresh shechinato al Yisrael ad she'asu melacha, which means when did God rest His shechinah with the Jewish people? In Har Sinai, it was a very temporary situation. Depending on how far you were from Har Sinai, That's the closest. And Moshe Rabbeinu was the only one who was able to go inside to the deepest levels to have that experience with the Shekhinah. While everybody had an experience with the Shekhinah, depending on one's level, there was more distance. Yes? But with the building of the Mishkan, what happened? We see at the end of Sefer Shemot, V'lo yachol Moshe Rabbeinu b'chvodo v'atzmo, even though on Har Sinai, he was able to go anywhere he wanted. When Hashem rested his kavod on the Mishkan, when it was completed, Moshe Rabbeinu could not go inside. V'lo yachol Moshe until Vayikra, until he was invited to come in. Why? So we see that the Hashra'at Shekhinah with Har Sinai, the giving of the Torah experience, was not as great as Hashra'at Shekhinah in the time of the completion of the Mishkan. Why? Because Har Sinai required no avodah from the Jewish people regarding their hands and labor. In these parashot, we read about the women and the men, what they did, everybody according to their specialty. This avodah is what brought the Shekhinah down. That's what it says, Rabbi Tarfon says. That melacha with avodat Hashem, that is the goal. Shena'emar, v'asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. Before my Shekhinah rests with you, first, there has to be v'asu li mikdash. In Avot Rabbi Natan, of course, this is brought in the regular Pirkei Avot as well. It says, Shemaya v'Avtalyon. Shemaya v'Avtalyon were two converts who became great rabbis amongst the Jewish people. Kiblu mihem, Shemaya omer, ehevet melacha, love work, usnot harabanut. Doesn't mean hate rabbis. That's not allowed. It means hate positions of leadership, hate titles, because titles really don't mean anything. A person has a title, that's great, but the action, what are you doing with that title? Maybe one day when you have an experience, there's a book called The 5 Levels of Leadership that's well known, and there's a TED talk about it on the internet. And receiving a title in a job is the lowest level of leadership, okay? The question is, what does one do? How does one motivate people to act in a job? In a learning circumstance, okay, the rabbi has a title, Baruch Hashem. But does that mean he can teach? No. Does that mean he can influence students to be better people? Not necessarily. So the title is what gets one in the door, but the development of leadership is more than the title. It's what one does with it. So, snot rabbanut, hate the rabbanut, which means don't run for titles. More important than titles are actually what you are doing. That title gives you an ability to do something. But if you don't do anything with that title, you just use that title, that's not leadership. Okay, so what does it say over here, Avot Rabbi Natan? Ketzad. How does this work? A person should love working. And don't hate the fact that one has to make a living, have a parnasah. Just like the Torah was given with a covenant on Har Sinai, similarly, the melacha was given to the world with a brit. Shene'emar, sheshet yamim ta'avod, ve'asita kol melachtecha, ve'yom ha'shevi'i shabbat la'Adonai Elohecha. That's called the brit of the Shabbat. We don't realize the Shabbat has 2 levels to it. One is the Shabbat itself, which is kadosh. And why is a Shabbat kadosh? Because the rest of the 6 days, one does melacha. A person is forbidden to have 2 days of Shabbat. Shabbat is 1 day, which is surrounded by 6 days, 3 and 3, depending how you look at it, the 3 before and the 3 after, is surrounded by melacha. What makes the Shabbat kadosh is, first and foremost, the fact that there is 6 days of melacha, and then there's the Shabbat. Minus those 6 days of melacha, where is the designation? Where is the separation? It's not there. So that's what it says, Ehovet melacha, which means one should not hate the fact that they have to make a living. One should absolutely love the fact that they have to make a living because that helps to one designate. But just like the Shabbat is a brit given to us by a brit, similar on Har Sinai, we receive the Torah by a brit. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Itim she'adam oseh melacha u'mitnatzel min hamita. Sometimes person does labor and he saves himself from death. V'itim she'en adam oser melacha, and sometimes a person doesn't do melacha, umitchayev mital shamayim, and he's required a death penalty from shamayim. Ketzad, how does this work? Yashav adam kol hashavua v'lo asa melacha. A person sat all week long and did no creative labor. Well, erev Shabbat, he has nothing to eat. Erev Shabbat, he has nothing to eat. And here's the example. That's how not doing melacha brings to death. Hayula ma'ot shel hekdesh. A person has ma'ot, money of hekdesh in his house. He wants to give a donation to the Bet HaKabayit or the Bet HaMikdash, and he says these money is going to be for the temple. Yes, now that is called hekdesh. Yes. And what happened? Because he didn't work all week long, he has nothing else to buy food from. So he takes the money of hekdesh and buys food for that. What's the problem with that? Mithayev mital shamayim. That's called me'ilah. That's called taking something that is hekdesh and changing it into something that is chol. Aval im haya poel veholech b'vinyan bet hamikdash. But if he was a worker and he went to work in the temple, and not for free, he gets paid. Even though he gets money from the Bet HaKabayit, from Hekdesh, bischaro, that is okay. That way of receiving from Hekdesh is mutar, and not to mention this gives life. Okay. Let's continue on. That's Avot Torah. There's more there, but I just want to move to other things. In Masechet Tamid, which discusses all the measurements of the Bet HaMikdash or the Bet HaMikdash, there's a discussion between the Ziknei HaNegev, the elders of the Negev. And why the Negev? What, there was a special yeshiva in the land of Israel in the Greek times that was in the Negev? Maybe so. Why, if one is going to build a yeshiva in Israel, the best place to do it outside of Yerushalayim or Tzfat or Tveria is the Negev. Why the Negev? Harotzeh lehachkim yadrim. A person who wants to become chacham, yadrim, goes south. So we see the south is the place of wisdom. It says over here, Asara Devarim Sha'al Alexandros Mokadon, Alexander the Great, Alexander of Macedon, asked Ziknei Midyan. And the Gemara goes through a bunch of them. I'm only going to quote a few that's related to what we're talking about. There are 10 things that Alexander asked the rabbis of the Negev to share the difference between, shall we say, Greek wisdom, or where there was nothing the Greeks had to say, versus there are times when the Greeks had something to say to compare it to what the rabbis said. Amar Lahem. Edin mitkare chakim. Who is worthy of being called a chacham? Who is worthy of being called a chacham? It's one thing to have a title of a rabbi. Not every rabbi is a chacham, and not every chacham is a rabbi. How do you tell the difference? A rabbi that's a chacham, if someone comes to ask a question, and you know that the answer they're looking for is an answer that you cannot give, and it's an important enough reason, the best thing to do under those circumstances, unless you're the posek hador, is to say, maybe you should go ask somebody else. Because once you give the psak, then they're forced to do it. And what's going to happen? Maybe they won't do it. Or maybe they can't do it. So a chacham understands where the question is coming from. And there's nothing wrong with the chacham saying, you know something? Ask somebody else. I don't really have an answer for you on that particular question. That's called anava. He knows the answer, but that answer is not right for that particular person. And maybe there's another chacham out there can give him the answer that he needs. That's appropriate for him at that time. So what does it say? Amale. So Rabbi Alexander Mokadon asked, how do we determine who's called a chacham? And of course, we know the answer to that in Pirkei Avot. Ezu chacham haro'et hanolad. What does that mean? Who is the truly wise person? Someone who sees something at its inception. If you want to invest in the stock market, the worst time to buy is when the stock is high. You wait till the stock goes down, knowing fully well that in the course of time it's going to go up again, and you buy low and sell high. That's how people make money in the stock market. That's in Melacha, but we have these other examples, Roy Tanolad. Or there's another example where it says, Chacham Enav Berosho. Translated, A wise man, his eyes are in his head. Let me ask you a question. Where are the eyes of the stupid man? Also in his head. So what does this mean, chacham enav berosho? It doesn't mean the eyes are in his head. It means his eyes are looking forward ahead. Same thing we just said over here in different words. Who's a chacham? A person could look and see what's coming rather than what is now. Continue on. Amar lahem, idin mitkare gibor. Who's called a gibor? What's an example of a gibor? Alexander Mokadon would say it's someone who takes a sword and can fight in the wars and be successful and carry booty, yes? Amrulo, ezu a gibor hakoveshet yisro. That's not a gibor. A gibor is someone who can overcome their inclination, their evil inclination to do things that are improper. Amar lehen, he asked another question. Eden mitkare ashir. Who is called wealthy? Who is called wealthy? Alexander Mokadon would say someone who has a gold and silver and all that kind of stuff. Avraham was very, very wealthy, as the pasuk says. The Avram kaved meod b'mikneh b'kesef u'b'zahav. Very interesting. When did anybody ever think that money or possessions makes one heavy? Generally, the more money a person has, the more freedom, at least we think we have with more money, because we could do more things, we could buy more things. But the parasha, the Torah tells us, the Avram kaved meod. As far as Avraham is concerned, if one wants to live a spiritual existence, money and property weighs you down. It doesn't necessarily lift you up. And we'll see more about this later on. It depends, of course, on how you use it. So who's called Ashir? Ezu Ashir? Asameach bechelko. A person that is happy, a person is satisfied with what they have, which means a person could be ani, a person could be a middle, or a person could be very wealthy. As long as the person is happy with the chelek they receive from Hashem, then they're truly ashir. We have many examples. We can look in Hollywood of people that are phenomenally wealthy and are actually miserable. Why are they miserable? Because they don't understand this. As it says, ohev kesef, lo yisba kesef. A person who loves money will never be satisfied with money. Continuing on in Masechet Tamid, Alexander Mokadon asked another question. Ma yavid inish v'yichyeh. What should a person do in order to ensure that they will live? Everybody wants to live Bezrat Hashem as long as possible. Amruleh, what did the rabbis say? Yamit atzmo. He should kill himself. But clearly the rabbis are saying something that's much deeper than the face value. Ma yavid inish v'yamut. And he asked another question. What should a person do if he wants to die? Yehayet atzmo. He should live. He should make himself live better. What does this mean? Amar lahen. Ma yavid inish v'yamut. What does it mean? That really, what does it mean to a person kill themselves? So you look at the commentary on this in the Rosh, which I saw last night, I thought was phenomenal to bring up. What is yamit et atzmo? Seems to me a person killed themselves, yeah? Yitrach b'melacha kedei leharviach mezonotav. A person should toil in his work in order to bring money or to be able to sustain themselves and their family. V'lo yomar en melacha zoho genet lo. And he shouldn't say, this melacha is not worthy for me. Think about all the problems that would be solved in Israel if we didn't have to port Arabic workers and Thai workers and African workers to do jobs that Israelis don't want to do, because, it's very hard when you have a lot of chiefs and no Indians. There always have to be chiefs and there have to be Indians, yes? So at the end of the day, you have a country full of chiefs and no Indians. They have to import Indians, kavyachol, to use a bad analogy, to do the work. But that's what gets them into trouble, when they're importing people into the land that are worshiping Avodah Zarah or want to kill them or other things. Better for a person to see what this says and says, what does this mean? There should be no melacha that is beneath a person. If this is the melacha that Hashem is designed for you to be able to make a living, that's not beneath you. It's what Hashem has given you. That's part of the idea of Ezu Ashir Hasamech Bechalko. I don't hear Hillel ever complain that his job was to carry water from the stream and deliver water to people. He didn't complain. And when it was frozen, the lake was frozen, and he had no job, he goes on top of the Bet HaMidrash so he can learn Torah. He realizes that if Hashem has prevented him from making melacha that day, so he's going to go and make sure he learns all day long. Yes? And that's a very important yesod that my rabbi taught me to be successful in business. A person should always have a sefer in the office. Why? Because when there's no customers, what do? You open up the sefer. You start to learn. Right away, the Yetzer Hara comes and says, "Oh, I can't allow learning. Learning is the worst thing for the Yetzer Hara. This is it says the Yetzer Hara was created, and the Torah is the tavlin. The Torah is the antidote. No, he's eating from the antidote. Let me send him more customers, because if he makes more money, that's how I'm going to get to him. But if he's learning, I can't touch him." So we see this is what it means when it says to love Hashem b'chol levavecha. But Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara. Yes, what are you going to say?
The harder more, because there's always more distractions that will distract you off learning.
Okay, but really, if a person is learning, the Yetzer Hara would much rather you be working, much rather you be watching TV, right? That would, first of all, it's interesting. There are no distractions when a person is watching a movie. They're focused 100%. There's no issue, right? But learning, that's how the Yetzer Hara comes to you. But really, what the Yetzer Hara really wants is doesn't want you to learn. Because learning is ultimately the destruction of the Yetzer Hara. Why is learning the destruction of the Yetzer Hara? Because who wakes up in the Tchiyat HaMetim? What's the mitzvah, the major mitzvah that carries us to the resurrection? Learning. Ubishoch becha, yishmorla, right? When a person wakes up in the resurrection, the Torah will say, this one is mine, and this one is mine, and this one is mine. And these are the people that are going to wake up. It's the zechut of limuda Torah that allows a person to wake up in the resurrection of the dead, to the point where the Gemara asks a question. Since women are piturot from Talmud Torah, it asks a question: in what zechut do women wake up in Tchiyat HaMetim? And the answer is by bringing their sons to the yeshiva to learn and allowing their husbands to go out and learn. This is how a woman has a chelek in Talmud Torah. The real Yisachar Zvulun between a man and a wife, not necessarily what we see in some segments, which may not be the real Yisachar and Zvulun. Okay, because that's two brothers. That's not a husband and wife. But continuing on, so we see over here, and in the resurrection of the dead, what's the first thing that happens? You wake up. What is the first thing you see? Ve'ata hakadosh baruch hu ve'shachat lemalach hamavet. So malach hamavet knows, the Yetzer Hara knows, the Satan knows that his end is to die and be slaughtered in front of lots of people. The more people that are learning, the more embarrassment he has that he dies in front of so many people. Continuing on. So we see the Rosh is explaining what is Yamit et Atzmo. It doesn't mean to kill oneself. It means to involve yourself Torah in melacha. So that person earns a living, right? That's why it says, Yegiat pecha ashrecha, yegiat kapecha, ashrecha v'tovlach. The toil of one's hands, ashrecha, it's good for you, it's beneficial, it makes you unhappy, v'tovlach, and it's good for you. Just learning alone is ashrecha, but not necessarily tovlach. The tovlach comes from asyat melacha with learning. So continuing on, Zohar get it lo, v'gam lo yimshochet besaro, and a person should not allow himself to be toiling in ta'anugim, in all kinds of pleasures. V'gam yitzta'eret besaro, and he has to cause himself, because learning is hard. Why is learning hard? Because it's always something better one could be doing than learning. That's the Yetzer Hara coming to you. Oh, watch this movie. Oh, go out and make a living over here. There's always something a person can do better than learning. That's how the Yetzer Hara comes to us. But by fighting against the ta'anugim of the olam, a person works so they can have what they need, okay? Not necessarily all the pleasures of life, because a person who's steeped in the pleasures of life is not going to be want to learn. They're going to want to make more money so they can have more pleasures of life, and that's a person in the wrong path. But a person on the right path is working and earning a living so that they can not necessarily indulge in delicacies, but to sustain themselves and to have a beautiful Shabbat. What is Yichyet Atzmo? So the opposite is, the Rosh says the opposite. Anything that's other than what we just said, person is not Torech b'melachto, that's called Memitet Atzmo. That's called that he's living, but that's what's causing him to die. And now we maybe have the better understanding of what it says in Parashat Chukat. Zot HaTorah, Adam ki yamut be'ohel, kol haba la'ohel k'v'yochol asher ba'ol yitma shivat yamim. This is the Torah. It already told us Zot Chukata Torah. Why does it come down and repeat for us right afterwards Zot Torah? Why is it saying this again? Adam ki yamut be'ohel. So from here we learn, in the Gemara teaches us what? Amar Resh Lakish. Minayin she'en divrei Torah mitkayamim. Where do we learn that divrei Torah are not existing, are not sustained? Ela b'mishe memit atzmo alea. But for someone who's willing to kill themselves to learn, shene'emar zot Torah, Adam ki yamut be'ohel. You want the Torah? Adam ki yamut be'ohel. But now, according to what the Rosh says, we have a completely different understanding than what's usually said. What does it mean, memit atzmo? He has melacha. He's yageya in his melacha, and from that he learns. And you'll see, depending on what you choose to do with your life, if you're going to be teaching full time, that's great. Melechat Shemaim is wonderful, but you're going to have to make a living because the Etzer Chaim doesn't feed you unless there's some kind of parnasa from that. But there's nothing wrong with a person having itim la Torah, which is the minimum, and that's great. And what you'll find is when you only have an hour or 2 hours to learn, your focus is going to be much better than when you have 10 hours to learn. And sometimes one can accomplish in 2 hours what other people can't accomplish in 10 hours. And the other idea also is it's not just a matter of what you're learning, but when you are learning. There are certain times that are better to learn than others. Between chatzot, at night, not midnight, but when Shalosh Maniot, and dawn, that is the best time to learn. According to the Sfarim, a person who learns between Chatzot and Alot HaShachar is 1,000 times the value of a person who learns during the day. So if I'm learning from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. in the morning, that has a value of 1. If I'm learning between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., that has a value of 1,000. Now, if a person is learning on Shabbat, it's 1,000 times what a person is learning chatzot during the week. And imagine the value, because if a person learns between chatzot and alot hashachar on Shabbat, that's 1,000 times what a person gets for an hour of learning on Shabbat during the day. So a person spending the time properly, when they have limited amount of time, especially Bezrat Hashem, between work and between children, all that kind of stuff, it's kiviyat itim. But when there are certain times that give a person much more, shall we say, oomph. So we understand mimitat tatzmo, according to the Rosh, is what? He has melacha. He works. Not that he's sitting all day long and learning. And if a person has a zechut to do that, that's great. But not everybody has a zechut to do that. So if a person doesn't have, don't be mitztaer. Ezu ashir hasamech bechalko. His halak is what? He has to go out and work. Nothing wrong with that. But he still has to be called va'itim la Torah. And then if we look in last week's Parashat Mishpatim, or actually at the end of Parashat Yitro, what does it say? It says, V'im mizbach avanim ta'aseli, when you make for me mizbach avanim, the mizbeach that's for the korbanot, lo tifnei tan gazit, you're not allowed to build them with metal. The stones have to be cut. There was a special type of worm called the shamir that they would use to cut the stones for the mizbeach. You cannot use metal. Why? Because what happens? The metal is also used for the making of a sword. The goal of the Mizbeach is to make shalom between us and Hashem, especially when we make mistakes and we make kol hanza avonot. The Mizbeach brings shalom between the sinner and God, or not even between the sinner. And nedavai brings closeness to Hashem. That's the whole concept of the korban, lekarev, to get close. But the cherev, what does it do? It involves itself in killing people. That does not bring a person closer to Hashem. That distance, unless it's a killing that's on a mitzvah level, like Mechiyat Amalek or something like that. So that's why now. Then it says over do not go on steps to my mizbeach, because then what's going to happen when you take steps? You're going to reveal your nakedness. In the good old days, men didn't wear underwear. Women didn't wear underwear. Everyone commando, yes? So one can imagine that if, as you're walking up step, what's going to happen? Your nakedness is going to be revealed. So the Torah says, no, you have to have a kevesh. You have to have a ramp. But there's a problem with that. What's the problem? In next week's parasha, not Parashat Truma, Parashat Tetzaveh, what are we going to learn? One of the gadim of the Kohen, even a Kohen Hedyot, is what? Michnasayim, pants. They didn't have underwear, but they had pants. Wait a minute. If the guy's wearing pants, even if he spreads his legs, that doesn't mean you see any nakedness. What's the Torah talking about? So there's all kinds of explanations. I think one from a spiritual point of view, the Rasha point of view is the erva is the ga'ava. There's something called pisi'at gasa, a person who takes big steps. Now, if a person's on the way to doing a mitzvah or is late for shul, one's allowed to take big steps. But there are some people, this is how they walk. They take big steps. What's that called? Ga'ava. That's a sign of ga'ava. It's called pisi'at gasa. So when a person takes big steps, that's called a ga'ava. One is not allowed to have ga'ava in the Bet HaMikdash, or for that matter, anywhere else, but especially not in the temple. And then it says, Ve'ele hamishpatim asher tasim lifnahem. What does Rashi say? Which, of course, is the next pasuk. It's the next parasha, but it's the next pasuk right after Mizbeach. So Rashi, of course, initially says, what is ele? Ele, when it comes to word ele, pasala tarishonim, which whatever before doesn't count. That's why it says ve'ele hamishpatim vava chibur, meaning what we have to connect the aseret hadibrot. That's a great summary. That's 10 sayings that summarize all the mitzvot. But ben adam lechavero, which is much of parashat mishpatim, we can't ignore that. Sometimes what happens is as people become more frum, they become nastier to people. They don't appreciate. Or their ben adam lechavero is not as important as their ben adam lemakom. Unfortunately, the mistake they make is that every ben adam lechavero is automatically a ben adam lemakom. And when a person leaves the world and they're in their funeral, lo alechem, not for 120 years, the malachim are sent down not to, God already knows what a person did. The malachim come to listen, what are the people saying about you? And that has a tremendous, that's why better if a person goes to a funeral, keep your mouth shut, don't say anything. If you have nothing nice to say, don't say anything. Because the malachim are coming to hear. They want to hear what is being said. Anyway, so continuing on, this is what Rashi says over here. Next, he continues and says, "V'lama nismecha parashat dinin parashat mizbeach." Why is the parasha of the mizbeach right next to the parasha of the mishpatim? Which means the Sanhedrin, where does it sit? What's the name of the place where the Sanhedrin sits? Lishkat Hagazit. We just read that the Mizbeach, what does it say? Lo tifnei eten gazit. You can't use a sword to cut the stones when a person is building the Mizbeach. But why did the Sanhedrin sit in a place called Lishkat Hagazit? Because it's the job of the Sanhedrin to cut the halacha. And that is also, when a person goes before a court case, there is always going to be one who's going to come out happy and one that's going to come out unhappy. Much better is a settlement, a shalom beforehand that they work out. They shouldn't have to go to court. But if they can't work it out, they go to court, and someone is a tzaddik and someone's a rasha. And the Torah terminology is not like we think. Rasha does not mean evil in that context. Rasha means guilty. Tzaddik means innocent. He may be a rasha, but in this particular halacha, he is innocent. Then he's called a tzaddik. And this might be the greatest rabbi, but if he's guilty in the court case because he owes money, in this particular case, he's called a rasha, chas v'shalom. So we understand from here that the Sanhedrin's responsibility is to cut the halacha. But one of the qualities that's required for anyone sitting on the Sanhedrin is to be very knowledgeable in the Torah. A person cannot be knowledgeable in the Torah if they don't work on the midah of ga'ava. Any ga'ava is dochek raglei shechina. It prevents the Torah information from properly being assimilated into the person's soul. And that's how you tell a Talmid Chacham. The Talmid Chacham is not just seeing by what they know, because Baruch Hashem, we have Rabbi Sefaria, and we have Rabbi Google, and we have Rabbi ArtScroll. I can find what you can't find. I mean, Torah T'mimah was a book written 120 years ago when putting these two things together was challenging. Now it's not. You go in Sefaria, Pasuk, it tells you any way you want to go. But what Sefaria and Rabbi Google and Rabbi ArtScroll are not, they don't have midot because they're inanimate objects. It's not just what is taught, but what is the midah? What are the midot of the person who is teaching it? Ki sifteh kohen yishmiru dat, ki malach Hashem tzvaotu. The Gemara tells us, a person, how do you choose a rabbi? Not only by what they teach and what they know, but how they behave. And if they're like a malach tzvaot, then you learn from them. If they're not like a malach tzvaot, then you should not be learning from them. And that question was asked in the context of Rabbi Meir when he was following Elisha ben Avua, Acher, asked him, how are you learning from him? And Rabbi Meir had his answer. He knows how to separate the wheat from the chaff. But anyway, everybody else, we want to make sure. So, we talked about that leadership part, a person to teach. It's not just a matter of what you know, but it's the passion and also the behavior. And that's why it says, Gadol shimusho milimudo. Because more important than learning from the person who's a chacham is watching how they behave. Practical information rather than academic, or shall we say, didactic information. Asher tasim lifnehem. What does it mean over there? It said, Ela mishpatim asher tasim lifnehem. Amalo HaKadosh Baruch Hu leMoshe. Hashem said to Moshe, Lo tale al da'atecha lomar eshne lahem haperek v'halacha bet o gimel pa'amim. Don't think to yourself, Moshe Rabbeinu, that you're going to teach them the halacha once or twice or three times. Ad shedeh sidura b'fihem kemishnata, and that they know it, they've memorized the halacha. That's not sufficient. And this is a big mistake in many places of education, unfortunately. Ve'eni matriach atzmi lahavinam tanei hadavar pirusho. But I'm not going to explain to them the why it's that way. There are 5 adverbs for asking questions. There's what, there's how, there's when, and there is, forgetting one. How, when, where, what, why. Out of all of those 5, the most important is the why. Sometimes educators spend a lot of time, present company excluded, spend a lot of time focusing on the first 4. But if a person truly wants to influence people, they have to also be able to answer the why. This is what Hashem is telling Moshe Rabbeinu. You have to know ta'ameh mitzvah. What is ta'ameh mitzvah? To the best of our ability. There are things we cannot know. But what is knowable, we are required to know it and give it over. That's the greatness of the Sefer HaChinuch. He brings all the mitzvot, and then what does he do? Mishoshe brings the reason according to Shikul Dat. Maybe he's right, maybe it's wrong, maybe it's one of a million reasons. But not to give ta'amim for the mitzvot, this is, of course, a problem. Continue on in the Sefer Dvarim, it says, Ki tetzeh machane elovecha mirishmata mikol ra. When a person goes to fight against the enemy, the machaneh has to be kadosh. Because if the machaneh is not kadosh, that's going to cause there to be difficulty in the battle. And what does it mean? Next pasuk, Ki yeh b'cha ish asher yeh lo tahor mikerei laila. You have a person who's not tahor because he had a seminal emission at night. V'yatsa michutz lamachaneh. He has to leave the machaneh. He can't stay inside. Lo yavo toch hamachaneh. Cannot come inside. Why? Because the machaneh has to be kadosh. In Masechet Avodah Zarah, there's an unbelievable discussion over there in page 20b. It says, Tanu Rabbanan. V'nishmata mikol ra, you have to be careful from any type of evil. Shelo yaher adam bayom, a person should not have all kinds of bad thoughts in the day. Ve'avoli de tum'a balayla, because what happens to a person when they dream, they're reviewing what they did during the day, what their thoughts were during the day. And based on what a person is thinking about during the day, that's what happens at night when a person doesn't have control. So a person should maintain themselves in their proper thought processes during the day, and that decreases the likelihood there's going to be difficulties and problems at night. Mikan, from here, Amar Rav Pinchas ben Yair, from here, Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, who is a known miracle worker. Torah mevi'ah lidei zehirut. When a person learns Torah, that's step 1. That's the bottom. He's going to give us a ladder of how a person rises up in holiness. The bottom of the ladder is Torah. If a person doesn't know Torah, they can't rise up in holiness because they don't know what to do and what not to do. Torah brings a person to zehirut, which is watchfulness. Zehirut midiyad del zehirut. Zehirut brings a person to alacrity, enthusiasm. Zrizut miviyad del nikiyut brings a person to cleanliness. Nikiyut miviyad de prishut brings a person to separation. Prishut miviyad de tahara. Tahara brings the prishut brings a person to tahara. Tahara miviyad chasidut. Tahara brings a person to piety. Chasidut miviyad de anava. Piety brings a person to anava. Anava miviyad de yirat chet. Anava brings a person to Yirat Chet, which means Ekev Anava, Yirat Chet. The result of Anava is Yirat Chet. Continuing on, Yirat Chet mevi'ah lidei kedusha. Kedusha is brought through Yirat Chet. Kedusha mevi'ah lidei Ruach HaKodesh. Kedusha brings a person to Ruach HaKodesh. Ruach HaKodesh mevi'ah lidei Tchiat HaMetim. Ruach HaKodesh brings a person to the resurrection of the dead, or being worthy of being resurrected. Continuing on. The Chasidut Gedula Mikulan. And Chasidut is above all of them, which means looking outside oneself. Shne'emar, az dibarta behazon lechasidecha. Then you spoke for piety for your pious ones. What I just quoted from Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair is very famous. Why is it famous? Mesilat Yesharim. When Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto decided to write his book on how a person should behave, his handbook of getting close to God, he built it on this because his goal was to bring the Tchiat HaMetim, and that's why he built it, because each Jew going through that handbook and getting close to Hashem, this is what brings Tchiat HaMetim. Upliga, but Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi disagrees. What does Rabbi Shimon ben Levi said, who was the friend of the Malach HaMavet? Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Anava gedola mikulan, which means you just said Chasidut is the most important. No. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says, no, Anava is the most important. Shne'emar, Ruach Hashem Elokim ala ya'an mashach Hashem oti levaser anavim hasidim lo ne'emar ela anavim ela lemidat she'anava gedola mikulan. So from here you learn that Anava is the highest one of these. And that's why it says in Pirkei Avot, in chapter 4 of Mishnah number 4, Rabbi Levitas ish Yavne Omer, me'od heve shefal ruach. A person should always be anav. Now, shefal ruach does not mean a doormat. Moshe Rabbeinu was anav mikol ha'adam asher pnei ha'adama, but no one can call Moshe Rabbeinu a doormat. Someone asked me this question when I spoke about it. What's the difference? How does a person become shafel ruach, right? Anav mikol ha'adam asher pnei ha'adama, but not be a doormat? Anava means I'm not better than anybody else. Hashem looks at me like everybody else. I'm no different. Vis-a-vis Hashem, I'm zero. Just like everybody's a zero, because infinity minus 1 and infinity minus 100 and infinity minus 1,000 is still infinity. But what is a person who's a doormat? That you have to recognize. We are the greatest creature on the planet. We have the most ability to affect change in the world, in the spiritual world. This Hashem gave us. That's a very high position. Comes with a lot of responsibility. That's not a doormat. Anyway, it says in Pirkei Avot, the next one, Rabbi Yishmael beno Omer, Halomed Torah al menat lelamed, a person who learns Torah for the purposes of teaching Torah, Misapekin biyado limod lamed. Hashem gives him the ability to learn and to teach. And what you'll see as you get older is when you teach, that's how you learn the most. Because if people ask you questions, you can't answer them, that forces you to go back and hit the books and learn them a little better. But a person who learns for the purposes of doing, not just for teaching, but doing, which means it's not just academics, but it's practical. Misapekim biyado lilmod ulamed lishmor velasot. So the greatest Talmud that is learned is not to teach. The greatest Talmud that is learned is maaseh. Of course, through your maasim, you'll be teaching that way. Rabbi Tzadok Omer, al tasem atara litgadel behem. Do not make them a crown to become great with them. Lo kadom lachpor behem, and not a shovel that you use to dig. Which means clearly we see that Pirkei Avot is saying that a person should be able to make a living generally through regular means, okay? And of course, there are certain situations where a person is teaching young people like the rabbis here. They could be doing other things. They could be studying Zohar. They could be studying all kinds of Finish the Shas, but they've chosen to spend their lives teaching young people. So that's worth the while of a sechar. But just to learn for the sake of learning without teaching, this is improper. He says that a person who uses the crown, we have to be very careful that when we're learning and when we're teaching, we're doing it for the right reason. L'shem shamayim. Hu haya omer, with this we'll be finishing up shortly. En bur yirechet v'lo ama aretz chasid. A bur cannot be yirechet. What's a bur? What's the difference between a bur There are three terms in the Mishnah: bur, ama aretz, chaver. Right? A bur doesn't know Torah shebichtav and doesn't know Torah shebal peh. Is empty, like a bor rek en bo mayim v'yesh bo nechashim v'akrabim. That's a bur. A bur, a person who doesn't know Torah shebichtav, he can't know what's right and wrong. How can he be yirechet? He doesn't know what's called a sin. Ama aretz chasid. That's much more common. What's a chasid? A person who goes above and beyond the call of duty. Well, in order to go above and beyond the call of duty, a person has to know Torah shebichtav and Torah shebal peh, because sometimes you do chasidut over here, but you're missing someplace else. A person has to make sure that whatever chasidut that they're doing is not subtracting from someplace else. You know what? I have to go to shul today. I have to be on time. I have to pray at nets. My wife's in labor. You take an Uber. I'm going to pray nets. Not a good idea for many reasons. But certainly that's a person who's chasidut, because he can pray later. He could pray in the hospital. He could pray after nets. Or if he's anus, he could pray mincha shtayim. But instead he lets his wife take an Uber, go to the hospital. Not a good idea. So it says over here, Am haaretz can't be chasid. V'lo habayshan lamed. And a person who's embarrassed doesn't learn. That's why students should never be embarrassed to ask a question. In my experience in life, when you have a question as a student, chances are there's at least 50% of the people in the room that have the same question you do, but they're too embarrassed to ask it. And remember, there's generally no stupid questions. There are mostly stupid answers, but not stupid questions. A question is important, and that's why if you think how Jewish learning is, how do we begin the seder? With questions. That means the goal of the teacher is to encourage the students to ask questions. And that's why it says, in a situation where a person is a chacham and he's alone, what does he do? He asks himself a question and then he answers the question. So we see, even if a person's alone, this concept of question and answer is very, very important. But a person shouldn't be embarrassed to ask questions. And the teacher should never run out of patience to explain it 100 or 101 times, because some students, that's what it takes. And if you think about how the Torah was first taught, Moshe Rabbeinu comes down, he teaches Aharon. And then what does he do? He teaches Aharon and Yehoshua. And then he teaches Aharon, Yehoshua, and the Zikanim. And then he steps out, and Aharon then teaches Yehoshua, the Zikanim, and others. So we see that it was repeated 3 or 4 times. This is how a person's supposed to learn. Okay, I think I'm out of time. Does anybody have any questions? Okay? Very good. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen. Baruch